Thanks to Albert this morning and to everyone who continues to help as Reverend Ryan and Reverend Suzanne are still out on parental leave with Eliza. I got to see her again this week. She's still awesome. And her older sister still thinks she's awesome. Stay tuned. As we enter into this third week of our sermon series on the prophets, last week, y'all, was heavy and hard, and I know that, and I am so grateful that this week with Isaiah lightens up a little. And I want to start with the end in mind. And it's a quote from Garrison Keillor. "The gentle people shall prevail." Especially after Amos last week, that's how this scripture has felt to me all week long. God reminding us through Isaiah that when the narrative of the world feels oppressive, and when the weight is heavy and the darkness is really, really dark, the light of God shows us that the way forward just might be different than we're used to or that we expect. And it isn't necessarily that challenging power with power or might with might and fist with fist, fighting anger with anger isn't God's way. The ancient words of Isaiah remind us and challenge us, and for some reason, continually surprises us that in God's great version of the Prairie Home Companion, the gentle people shall prevail. You see, it didn't seem coincidental to me this week that not one, but two articles from Garrison Keillor ended up in my reading list. I haven't had one article from Garrison Keillor in a very long time, let alone two. But both of them included this line: "The gentle people shall prevail." The first one was used in a devotional in a meeting I was in this week, and the news from Lake Wogaban was actually from Eugene, Oregon. And the great storyteller was sitting in a bar on a Friday night, talking with a group of people about really important matters like barred owls and limericks and aging and Ireland and everything other than what had been on the news lately. And the conversations among them centered around the ordinary, uncelebrated people living extraordinary lives, but who will never make the cover of Time magazine or win an Emmy or a Grammy or end up on Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. Because we just don't consider them very interesting. And then an elderly gentleman at a bar table just over from them overheard and joined in their conversation, because that's what happens in good bars on Friday night. I mean, really. And this elderly gentleman was 92 years old. And he'd grown up in Berlin in World War II. He was the son of a Jewish father and a Lutheran mother, and he'd been in a labor camp. And after some time hearing his story and through their tears, the group affirmed his story as being very, very interesting. And they pressured him, "You should really write all this down. His story should be told." And the old man brushed them aside, and their focus on the past, and pointed them towards a different future, a more gentle way forward. And so Garrison Keillor writes in the Washington Post that there they were, an ornithologist, a mathematician, a priest, a writer of limericks, and a survivor of the Holocaust, all cast together on a Friday night in a bar. And he wrote, nothing was said this whole time about the Hollywood producer or the New York real estate tycoon who'd been in the news lately. Quote, they are irrelevant, hugely, end quote. Just needed you to know that that was Garrison Keillor and not me. The patience you see of a Japanese linguist whose story was told, who made a dictionary for strangers, and the joyful spirit of the Holocaust survivor who had witnessed more human suffering than everyone in Eugene combined. You see, those are the stories that really matter. The great storyteller explained, the gentle people shall prevail. Count on it. And I couldn't help but make the connection from that story to the scripture. You have to remember that the original hearers of this scripture did not view it in the context of Jesus, like many of us do, because Jesus wouldn't arrive for another 700-ish years. And these people for whom Isaiah was speaking, they had been walking in darkness and living in the deep shadows of war and exile. And Isaiah is telling them that their future would be very different, could be very different, if only they would trust in something different, if they would trust in a new way, doing life in a way that was out of the ordinary and against what everyone else thought was the right way. To do that, they would have to change their notion of what power would look like, what success would look like, just like another Jewish prophet 700-ish years later would do. The problem for us is that some of us know this text very well, too well perhaps. It's usually read every Christmas Eve, so even if you only show up twice a year, you've probably heard it. But imagine hearing this for the first time, that the burdensome yoke would be shattered, the weight lifted, the oppressive rod broken. And then the words, for a child is born to us. And somewhere the cynic says, a baby. Seriously? How ordinary and uninteresting and improbable, really. Because the idea of gentle people prevailing is still really laughable if we think about it. Gentle people standing up to a powerful gun lobby or a Hollywood executive or a district attorney or bullies on the playground. And yet the great scholar of Isaiah, Walter Brueggemann, reminds us that God is always creating new possibilities for a hopeful future. God is always recruiting human agents to be co-creators in the world, doing the work of shattering yokes and lifting weight and being a light in dark places. God is always inviting ordinary people without very interesting stories to work in ways that are unexpected, in new ways, in gentle ways. Even and especially perhaps those of us whom aren't normally seen as very gentle people, maybe especially us. I have to consider myself in that group because perhaps you know that I can be loud and pushy. You don't have to laugh because it's true. I can be loud and pushy, and as my girlfriend Erin Wathen posted to my Facebook page, she and I are among the women considered to be too much. That's a sermon for a different day, that Facebook post. But I'll always probably be too much. But as we move into this Thanksgiving and then into Advent and into Christmas, I'm really trying to hear these ancient words of the prophets, these promises of God that a different way is possible, especially as the world continues, it seems, to get bigger and louder and angrier. And some of us think the response has to be power with power and fight and getting our voices even louder and stomping our stilettos even harder. Because that's the way it's always been. And how's that working out for us? And this scripture and the entirety of the gospel story really reminds us that God's story is a different one. In every single episode of God's great series of The Prairie Home Companion, even and especially the episode that would transpire 700-ish years later, that would show us the same. Meeting power with humility and kindness, and paying attention to the things and the people that no one else is paying attention to. Yes, less yelling. More stories from Lake Galilee, perhaps. For unto us a child is born, and the cynic in you rolls her eyes. And we'll continue to try to do it in the same old way that we've always done it. And the prophets will continue to preach God's message of a different way. And maybe there might be a few more modern day prophets like Garrison Keillor who can help us hear that ancient prophecy like Isaiah, maybe even of Jesus in a new way. And maybe, just maybe, the gentle people will prevail. May it be so. May it be so for us.